The mind-body problem is one of the more pressing dilemmas that modern philosophers face today, with the ideas and attempts to put the human mind into a computer, or attempt to give an AI sentience. The idea of where the thinking part of the human comes from, and how it connects to the physical part of the human, is something that we are increasingly dealing with every day. The mind-body problem, defined precisely, is the question of how the brain and consciousness interact with each other. Are they one and the same? Are they two separate things? Is everything an illusion? Those are what the solutions to the mind-body problem seeks to answer. One of the more interesting solutions posed to the mind-body problem is that proposed by Spinoza, the 17th century philosopher who codified the God that many, including Einstein, believed to their death. Spinoza saw the solution to the mind-body problem to be that everything was the same, each a facet of God. To be clear, that is not the God that we traditionally think of in a Judeo-Christian sense, which is a man up in the sky who can change everything and is impossibly good and impossibly kind. Spinoza had many ideas about religion, but he mainly believed that all of those were incorrect, and that the only thing we could be sure of through the texts and logic was that God was a being of infinite properties that extended infinitely. His solution to the mind-body problem was that everything was the same facet of God. He didn't just state this without offering proof. In order to find the logic behind Spinoza's reasoning, there are three main questions we need to answer. What is Spinoza's God, and how do we know he is real? Why are the mind and body necessarily separate? And how does God fix the issues with this that are proved? And how does God fix the issues that are caused by the second? Spinoza had an interesting definition of God. As compared to the typical Judeo-Christian God, or most gods in fact, he didn't believe that it was some omnipotent person in the sky that had in mind our best interests and wanted to promote good in society. He felt that this was too much derived from human interests, and was not looking at what he felt to be the facts of the case, which were those things that could be purely derived from logic and reason, as well as the source material, which he considered things like the Bible and the Quran. From there, he found only a few things that he felt were consistent, and they all summed up that God was an infinite being with all possible attributes and properties. His proof that his God existed went as follows. He starts with the axiom, a thing must exist. He means that, because by its nature, by how it is defined, a thing must exist in reality. Otherwise it is not that thing as is defined by the words we used. He then goes on to attempt to prove God by contradiction, which is to prove that the opposite of what he is trying to prove cannot occur. So he then wants you to assume that God does not exist. That said otherwise could mean that God does not have the property of existence. But God is a thing, and things by their nature, as stated above, must have the property of existence. You may say that, doesn't God have all properties? No, he only has all of the possible properties. Since God, not existing, is illogical because he's a thing and things must exist, and by him not existing, that just doesn't check out, then that means God must exist by Spinoza's logic. Since we know that Spinoza's God must exist, that we can use this to prove that there is only one thing. Logic goes as follows. Each thing has at least one property. This isn't things like it is red, it is hot. These are, he's referring to what could be called base properties, the thing that means it is that thing. Such as maybe for a cardboard box, it is made out of cardboard, it is in a box shape. These would be its base properties. Something like a circle would mean it's made up of an infinite number of equidistant points from a center. These are the base properties that Spinoza is referring to. He then goes on to say that two things cannot share the same properties. He means that if two things did share the same base properties, for again, he's not talking about properties, but base properties, if they shared the same base properties, they would be the same thing. And if two things are exactly the same, then they are one thing. He then goes to pull in his definition of God, who, as we stated above, he has all possible properties. Because God exists, that means that there is an entity somewhere out there, a being with all possible properties, including all possible base properties. Because God has all properties, including base properties, that means that everything would have to share their base properties with God. But since two things cannot share the same property, that means that they would not be able to exist. This, putting it into more realistic terms and pulling it from the abstract, would be like a chair. God is everything. God is all of the properties. God is that chair. And a chair could not exist there. It would have to have the same base properties as God, but God is already there with that chair. Putting a pin in the idea of Spinoza's God and what that implies, we move on to the separation of mind and body, or Spinoza's proof of that. This is based heavily on Descartes' ideas and proof of the separation of mind and body. He starts with the idea of I think, therefore I am, which is what Descartes started with. It is the only thing that he found possible to prove. He came to that conclusion because he found that he could doubt everything else, except the fact that he was doubting. And doubting is thinking. In order to think, you needed a being to think. In order to think, though, you also need a mind to think it. The mind and the being could be considered effectively the same thing. However, Descartes found that he couldn't prove that he had a body, or really anything in the physical world, since it could be a dream, or he could be fooled that he was a different physical body. That leaves you with the idea of something that you know for sure exists and thinks, and something and everything else beyond that you do not know exists. Because the thinking does not necessitate a body, as we could be completely wrong about, well, pretty much anything, according to Descartes, then there is absolutely a difference, because you cannot be sure about the body, but you can be sure about the mind. The question then arises of how the two are able to interact, if one is physical and the other is mental. Descartes' idea, or his solution to this, was the ideal of the pineal gland being the gateway from the mind to the brain. Spinoza was around at the same time as Descartes, and upon seeing this had issues with the idea. Spinoza's main issue with this was he didn't see how that was a solution to the issue of one being physical and one not being physical. With the pineal gland, that just kicks the issue down from the brain to the pineal gland. How does the pineal gland and the mind interact? And that wasn't something that Spinoza felt that Descartes resolved. He came up with that there could never be a solution with the ideas presented, using the logic as follows. The physical cannot be known for sure, because as Descartes proved earlier, it could be a dream, it could be a trick, your eyes could be fooled. There are any number of ways that the physical that we know could be incorrect. Maybe you're in the Matrix. The brain and body, and anything else in there, are physical, meaning they cannot be known for sure. The mind can be known for certain, since it is the thing that does the thinking, and we can know that we think. In order for two things to interact, they have to be on the same plane of existence, the same physicality. You can't have an object that is non-physical interact with an object that is physical. It just doesn't make sense. That's like you from 5 minutes ago interacting with the you from now. There's no connection, as shown in the diagram. Since the mind and body have two different physicalities, they should not ever be able to interact with each other, as there's nothing connecting them. However, they do actually seem to interact. I can freely think of something, I can tell my body to move, and it moves. So, how does that work? Spinoza's answer to this was, of course, as always, turning back to religion, God. Spinoza's solution to this issue was that they weren't in fact unable to interact because they were all part of the same God. And more specifically, they weren't just able to interact through God. They were the same thing, but on different extensions of God, different facets of God. Think of it like a mirror and a person looking into a mirror. Two different things, the same thing, but on different planes. One in like a mirror plane, and one in the plane of reality. Both of those are based in physicality. Moving that analogy to the mind-body problem, you have the mind and body as one extension of God, like the person in the mirror analogy, and you have the mind in the non-physical realm as the mirror in the analogy. Both of those are connected to God. Spinoza felt everything in the physical realm had the property of extension. Non-physical realm was the idea of something in the physical realm, which he called the property of thought. So you could have a physical orange, and the idea of an orange would have the property of thought in the non-physical realm. From there, the idea of the physical thing could change, such as if you stub your toe, then the impulses would go to the brain or to the body, and then the idea of that thing would change accordingly, which is how we're able to make decisions and think but not actually able to interact, because the connection only goes one way, through God, through changing that idea. Spinoza's ideas have been supported across time. One of his more sketchy proofs, his proof of God, was backed up by the three cosmological arguments for God, which argue that there must be an unmoved mover who started all of the moving, an uncaused causer who started the cause and effect chain that we see today, and something that must exist. All of these in order for reality to function as we see it now. These would normally not really be a proof of God, such as the Judeo-Christian God or really anything, since they could just be like a rock. But they do actually prove Spinoza's God quite well, because Spinoza's God is just a large pile of rocks. It is just nature. Spinoza's ideas of God have also been supported by many intelligent people, including Einstein, who was a supporter of Spinoza and Spinoza's God until his death, due to its largely scientific approach and non-reliance on things such as prayer. Spinoza's ideas also coincided with people who felt that reality was not as it seems, as in Spinoza's idea of the world, reality was not as it seems, not a pile of individual rocks. He was closely associated with many monists, such as Parmenides, who believed that there could only be one thing. Many of the arguments used for monism apply quite well to Spinoza's idea, and thus back up his claims. So to summarize what we've learned today, we know that the mind and body are different because we can prove the mind, but not the body. We know that we require an alternate solution for them to interact because the physical cannot interact with the non-physical, it just doesn't make sense. And we know that God is real because he cannot logically exist, and because he has all of the properties that could possibly exist, nothing can be different from him, so everything is him. These two ideas combine to solve the mind-body problem because everything is God, thus they are able to interact with each other through God as a reflection of one another in the physical and non-physical realm.